Thank you, Eric. So today we are starting a brand new series that's going to take us through to the end of September about being a superhero to your community. Perhaps you recall back in the late 50s a broadcast that made it into your living room. Faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive, able to leap tall buildings in a single pound. Look, up in the sky, it's a bird, it's a plane, it's Superman. Yes, it's Superman. Strange visitor from another planet who came to Earth with powers and abilities far beyond those of mortal man. Superman, who can change the course of mighty rivers, bend steel in his bare hands, and who, disguised as Clark Kent, mild-mannered reporter for a great metropolitan newspaper, fights a never-ending battle for truth, justice, and the American way. This was the introduction of Superman onto our television screens in the late 50s. And while modern historians of pop culture argue about who was our first superhero, they all agree that Superman was the first superhero to make it firmly into that American consciousness of superheroes. It began in the 30s with the comic strips, and it has a very interesting history. I want to share with you something I learned by T. Andrew Wall, who is a comic book historian. He tells us about the origin of comic books and superheroes in America. He says that jazz and comic books are the two greatest American art forms. They emerged from the same socioeconomic phenomenon. In the first half of the 20th century, coming out of the Depression, immigrant communities are looking for ways to empower themselves, both professionally and creatively, and are good at telling stories. The role that Jewish immigrants played in the origins of the comic book market cannot be understated. Superman is an immigrant story. He comes from another planet and lands in America to pursue a better life. Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, Joe Kubert, Will Eisner, Jerry Segal, and Joe Shuster, the co-creators of Superman, are some of the legendary figures that were from their very earliest of years, and they were all children of Jewish immigrants. So that immigrant story is just built into the DNA of comic books, and particularly in the golden age of comics. Superman, superheroes, part of the pop culture of some being with supernatural abilities come here to save us from evil, right? The superhero always has some supernatural ability and is fighting evil with good. And it's always this idea that it has to be supernatural. It's beyond our individual abilities as human beings. We are looking for that Savior to come and save us from the evil. This is the image of the superhero. And perhaps in part we have accepted that idea that we cannot be superheroes on our own, that we are not the ones to come in and save ourselves, as our opening song spoke about today. One of the things that Gary and I did on our time away was to listen to an audiobook, a 13 hours worth of audiobook, a book called Unbroken, written by Laura Hillenbrand. And it's the story of Louis Zamperini. Louis Zamperini, who was an Olympic runner in the 1936 Olympics, came in 8th and was recognized to be the one that was likely to break the 4-minute mile before World War II interfered. Louis went on to work in a bomber plane, and at one point in time during, I think it was 1942 or 43, he was shot down. And he and a couple of his mates ended up drifting on the sea over 2,000 miles in a little life raft. Listening to their journey, it seemed almost unbelievable, as they were living off of little bits of rain collected and little fish or birds that they were able to capture, fighting off a great white shark, for goodness sakes. Every step of the way that Louis went in this journey just seemed remarkable. Eventually captured by the Japanese, held in a POW camp until the end of the war, there was questions several times whether Louis would make it. And what really impressed me about this particular story was the human spirit that can both be good or working for evil. Because within this story, there was absolutely no doubt that some of those people who were in charge of those POW camps were coming from the worst of the human spirit. That the war and what war brings out is coming from the worst of the human spirit. And yet Louis and his fellow servicemen and their ability to survive spoke of the other part of the human spirit, that part that does almost seem supernatural when you realize and recognize what we as human beings can overcome. Louis was eventually released from that POW camp and, not surprisingly, experienced great stress, what we would today define as post-traumatic stress disorder, upon returning home. He turned to alcohol. He almost gave up on his life. And then, surprisingly, his wife convinced him to go to a Billy Graham event. Billy Graham at that time was going across the country in his tent, revival tents, and sharing his message with the world. And the second time that Louis went, he began to have flashbacks to the time, those 46, 47 days when he was floating on this raft, where he thought for sure he was not going to survive, where he spoke to the divine in prayer, something Louis didn't typically do, and said, "I will devote my life to you if I make it through this." Throughout the experience of being a POW and being released and dealing with the trauma, that idea had gotten lost in Louis's mind. But that night at that Billy Graham event, that thought percolated back up to the surface, and Louis saw it, received it, and changed his life, dedicated his life to Christ. And he went on to live to 97 years old, helping youth. His is an inspiring story. I would suggest it's a superhero story. A story of overcoming great odds, a story of overcoming evil with good, a story of forgiveness and redemption, a story of finding the good, a true superhero story. And so I'm inviting you and I to step back from the idea that a superhero has to be a supernatural Superman from another planet, and recognize and realize that you and I each have the ability to be that Superman, that superpower, that superhero for ourselves and for our world and for our community. So today we're going to talk about the power of communion. Now I wanted to share with you a little bit of the etymology and definition of communion. So communion is from an old French word meaning community. Communion means fellowship, participation, a sharing. Communion has the same root as community. Community, which I'm told in etymology online, is of the common people. In other words, not the rulers, not the clergy, but the common people, you and I, common man, right? Not a supernatural superhero, but an ordinary human being like you and I, gathering together in community, in communion. Webster's Online tells us that community is a coming together to sharing of an idea or a spiritual experience. So what I want to suggest to us today is that we have the power of communion When we come together as community, centering in that awareness of God that stands under all of creation and truly gives us the power as human beings to rise above whatever the situation or circumstance may be, to reveal the good for ourselves and the community of which we are a part. That community could be as small as the family that you live in. That community could be your spiritual community, Unity Spiritual Center Westlake. That community could be your greater community of your state or your country that you live in. That community can be the world community of humanity. But you and I have the ability, through our communion with the divine, to overcome whatever challenge or situation there may be. In addition to listening to this book on tape during our time away, I also read a book by Joe Dispenza, one you might have heard about. It's called Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself. And as I was reading the one chapter in this book, I was just blown away because I was reading unity within this book. Joe Dispenza talks about metaphysics and quantum physics, the idea of quantum physics and what science has come to understand now about this world that we live in. According to Joe Dispenza, 99.99999% of you and I and this world is nothing but space, pure potential energy. And that from this pure potential energy, subatomic particles are formed. And from those subatomic particles that are formed, the atom is formed. And as that energy level of the atom begins to get denser, it becomes the molecule. And as that molecule vibrates at a more denser rate, slows down enough, it becomes the very cells that are present here. And as those cells begin to vibrate at a denser rate, those cells become the very tissues of our bodies. And as those tissues begin to vibrate at a lower rate, those tissues become the very organs and systems that eventually collapse into this particle from that wave of all potential that I call me or you. And as I read that, what I heard was God as divine mind consciousness that is standing under it all, out of which you and I demonstrate. Here is quantum physics telling us the exact same thing. We all arise out of this field of pure potential. Anything is possible as we allow our mind to open up to those divine ideas. And how do we do that? Well, of course, we do that by taking the time to be in communion with the divine, to be still, to understand that that very power and presence that is God is beating my heart, breathing my lungs, and thinking my mind. This is our reality. And quantum physics, from my perspective, has just verified that for me. I lit up when I read that in Joe Dispenza because I knew that that was our purpose. Unity Spiritual Center comes together to remind you and to remind me of the divine potential that is present and available here in this moment, and we can become superheroes for our communities when we get that. It is from that pure potential that I arrive. But like me, you might be thinking, well, that's all fine and well, but let's go back to the story of Louis Zamperini and how that pure potential gets demonstrated and expressed in ways that you and I might describe as evil. How does that come about then? Well, that took me back to another book that I read years ago, a book called Power versus Force by Dr. David Hawkins. In that particular book, David Hawkins puts out a map of the scale of consciousness. In other words, there's that consciousness that is pure potential for you, for me, for all of life. And out of that, the energy begins to slow down at lesser and lesser vibrations to become the physical collapse of you and me. But we are all part of that collective divine consciousness. And so this map of consciousness that Dr. Hawkins puts forth shows that the very lowest level of consciousness, human consciousness, is shame, humiliation, and that we move from there to guilt, to apathy, to grief, to fear, to desire, to anger, to pride, to courage, the courage that I saw expressed through that story of Louis Zamperini, to neutrality, to willingness, to acceptance, to reason, to love, to joy, to peace, and eventually resonating at a level of enlightenment. You see, we all have a choice. Although we are all connected to that pure divine potential, we all have a choice of where we are going to resonate. Shame, victimhood, blame, love, compassion, kindness. The choice is ours. And what Louis Zamperini found in that evening when he was with Billy Graham in that tent was the ability to rise above the shame and the anger and the victimhood, to remember the truth of what he was and what he experienced. And that is that divine potential that is available for you and I in any moment. And as we do so, we become the superheroes, just like Louis was. We become the superheroes for our community. We don't have to arrive on Earth from another planet. We don't have to have abilities that we would describe as supernatural to be a superhero to our community. We simply need to be in communion. Communion with God and communion with one another. Before I left, the day before I left, I don't even know, to be honest with you, where I got this quote, but all of a sudden a quote showed up for me, and I took a picture of it because I knew it would speak to me about this idea. And it's a quote from Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. This is it. There is almost a sensual longing for communion with others who have a large vision. The immense fulfillment of friendship between those engaged in furthering the evolution of consciousness has a quality impossible to describe. This is what I'm inviting you and I into, this longing for communion with others with this larger vision of what we can accomplish together as we center in the pure potential of this moment, evolving our own individual consciousness, and in the process, evolving the consciousness of humanity. You have the power to do that. I have the power to do that. And this is what we are here to practice. So I want to share with you our spiritual practice for this week. This week, I want us to all practice being in communion with God. Talking to God. Talk to God as you would a friend. Listen for the divine ideas that are being shared with you through divine mind consciousness. Turn back to God each time you realize you have moved once more from an awareness of your oneness. Be in the question of, how can I be the divine heart of love in this moment? How can I be that for my community? This is our practice. We also have another opportunity. This whole series is designed to support you in understanding how your community can support you in developing these superpowers so you can be a superhero for your community. And it's all leading up to our fall program. Our fall program this year will begin on October 4th. And we're using the book See No Stranger, a memoir and manifesto of revolutionary love by Valerie Kaur. Small groups will meet in Zoom rooms this year at various times throughout the week. This is our opportunity to come together in common union and have a conversation not only about spiritual ideas, but deep, heartfelt, life-changing ideas that can change our world. Sign-ups will begin this Tuesday on our website, and at that point you'll be able to check what times the various groups are meeting and sign up for one yourself. The groups will begin meeting the week of October the 4th. So, we can walk you through that process. If going online and registering, you have troubles, you can call the office and Roberta will help you to get registered. But this is our opportunity to join together in small groups. Just as Pierre Teilhard de Chardin talked about longing for those groups who have a greater vision. This is what we are about and what we want to offer to you. So, in addition to your spiritual practice this week, on Tuesday, go find a group that you'd like to join. Plan to join us, go buy the book, and we will have a fabulous discussion on how we can see no stranger and in the process, activate our superpowers to be superheroes for our community. And now we're going to go back